In this video, we're going to talk about the process by which we upgrade an existing version of RackForms to the newest version. Now, this is basically a 5-step process, and we're going to go through each one of these in some detail. The purpose of this entire exercise here is to make sure that when we perform the update, it's done with no errors and results in as little downtime as possible for our existing form editors and form users. So let's get started. So the first step is we want to make backups. And the backups are going to come in two main varieties. One, we're going to make a database backup, and the other is we're going to make a file system backup. Now, before we get into that, it is important to take quick stock of the environment that I'm using right here, because yours will obviously be just a little bit different. Maybe a different operating system, different file managers, etc. So my specific setup is I'm on a Mac, and I actually have a virtual machine running CentOS 7. And the virtual machine then is being accessed in two places. The first is with Dreamweaver, hiding back here, and I'm using that for FTP capabilities. And then the other is I have my SQL Workbench running, and this is accessing my database. So that is how I'm using and running this system. Okay, so first things first then, I want to make the backups of the database. So I'm going to go into, again, in this case, my SQL Workbench. I'm going to select Data Export. I'm going to select the RackForms schema, and I'm going to hit Start Export. Now, what's important about this process is that this is not actually going to be used for anything further. This is just so we create a nice snapshot of our database before we start the export process. Okay, so step 2 is to grab a backup of our file system. And the easiest way to do that is, again, to use the simplest possible method on your operating system. Now, in my particular case, I actually don't have the luxury of using a file manager, right? I'm just on a terminal, so that means that I'm going to have to kind of path into my, my web directory here and use, in my particular case, a zip command manually. So I'm going to want to say something like zip recursive the RackForms folder, and we're going to save that to something called rackforms.zip. Whoops. Oh, sorry. It's been a while since I've used the zip command. There we go. So this is now going to create a folder, a backup of the entire RackForms folder, and is going to create a file called rackforms.zip. And so there it sits. Now again, your process will be potentially slightly different. So if you're actually using an operating system, we could usually just say right-click on something. Let me just drag this off here, and in like the case of Mac, I could say compress. If you're on Windows, usually it's send to zip. And if you're into something like cPanel, it would be you'd select a folder and say compress, right? So there's different ways you can do it, but in my case, this is how we did it. At the end though, the goal is to have a file called rackforms.zip. Okay, so then we're going to go to step 2, which is we're going to grab the newest version of RackForms and we're going to unzip it. Now to save you the pain of having to watch that, I've already downloaded it and I've unzipped it to my desktop right here. Now we're going to merge files. So this is a process by where we're going to take this zip file and we're going to merge config files in an output folder with the new version that we just downloaded. Now, in order to perform that step, of course, I'm going to need to somehow access this rackforms.zip file. And so that's where Dreamweaver is going to come in handy here, is I'm going to take a look at the remote server. And again, this is just essentially looking at this file structure right here. And you can see now that I have my test.php file, index.php, my RackForms folder, that is the currently running version of RackForms. And then, hey, look at that, my rackforms.zip file, that guy that I just created right here. So I just want to get that so that it's available to me on my local file system. So if I go to my local view now, I can see rackforms.zip. And what it actually means is that if I go into my, in this case, htdoc CentOS 7 folder, voila, there it is, rackforms.zip. So this is the folder that I created right here on my virtual machine, got it with FTP, and now it's available on my Mac. And so what we want to do is we want to merge our files. We want to merge our 2 config files in our output folder. So how do we do that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. So here is the currently running version of RackForms. It's just zipped up. So I want to go ahead and basically open it in whatever my zip manager program is. and I'm going to do this. I'm going to open up the new version of RackForms. Let me make this smaller here so it's a little bit easier to see both. And I'm going to grab from the app folder config.php from the old version, and I'm going to replace the version that's in the new folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and literally just drag and drop and replace it. So I'll say yes, replace that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually open that file in a text editor of some sort, and I'm going to double check to make sure that the values for my username, password, and catalog match my currently running production values. In other words, this should not be blank or default. These should be your actual database login credentials. And I can see this is RackForms test and RackForms, so that looks good. Then I'm going to go into my zip folder again, or wherever I have that saved version, and I go into the move files folder, so app move files, and there's going to be a second config file. I want to go ahead and grab that and replace the version that's in RackForms app move files on the new version. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Once again, it's going to ask me if I want to replace it, and I'll just say yes. And then once again, I'm going to make sure that this config file is indeed the one that came from my live server. So again, the username, password, and catalog should all be values that match your server. Finally, we have one last file to merge. And pardon me, it's actually a folder. It's the output folder. So we're going to go back to our RackForms directory. So again, here is that folder. And I'm going to take the output folder. And usually the way I like to do this is I actually like to delete the version that's on the new version of RackForms first. So I'm just going to literally just delete that entire folder. And then I'm just going to take the version from my zip file and drag it off like so. Okay, so let's review exactly what we've done so far. Let me actually close everything here. So the first thing I did is I made a backup. I made a backup of my database using my SQL Workbench, and I just basically stowed that off somewhere. We don't need it, but it's good to have a snapshot again of everything before we started. Then I made a backup of my file system. And the easiest way to do that was I issued a zip command. So I created an entire zip of my RackForms folder. And then I used, in this case, my FTP program to basically grab that zip and put it on somewhere where I can access it locally. I then opened up that zip file and I merged my two files. I took the config.php files from that zip file and I replaced the first one in app.config.php, and then the second one was an app move files config.php. I then backed up and I went to the root of the RackForms folder. There's that output folder. I deleted it and then took the version again from the zip and placed it in this folder. Finally, from this folder, going on to step 4 now, I'm going to delete install.php from the new version. So here is a file called install.php. We're just going to delete that guy entirely. Okay, so now the last step then, several sub-steps, but the last main step here is we're going to zip up this new instance of RackForms. So obviously just use your zip program of choice. In this case, I'm using a neat little program called encrypted zip. And I'm going to actually call this something like RackForms new. Make sure it doesn't have a password, and I'm just going to save it. And this is then going to be the newest version of RackForms with our config files and our output folder. So this is our saved version of RackForms. So it's basically this guy zipped up. Then we're going to upload it to our server. So again, this will depend on how you have your file system set up, but in my case, I have htdocs, CentOS 7. I'm just going to drag this folder right here. So now I should have in my web server folder here, I should have this RackForms.new, and I'm just going to put that on my server. Now in this case now, I should just be able to, in this case, look at the structure of this folder, and I should see that I have a new folder called RackForms-new.zip. So here was that original RackForms.zip, and here's now the new one. Okay, so at this point now, I need to unzip that folder and replace the existing one. So this is, again, going to depend on the operating system and software they're using. In my case, it's literally just a case of issuing a command called unzip. However, there's one thing that we need to do first, which we need to rename this folder right here to something like RackForms-old. So I'm going to say move RackForms to RackForms-old. And this is now rename that folder to RackForms-old. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to unzip RackForms-new.zip. This is going to extract the entire contents of that folder, and because we saved the original and it came from a folder called RackForms, I should just be able to see a folder called RackForms right here. The last step then, actually let me add one on here. We're going to delete all old files and folders. Now in this case, it's mainly just files that we have. Specifically, I have this RackForms-new.zip and RackForms.zip. We don't need these anymore. So I'm just going to say do that. And so now I should just have two folders. And the reason why I like this particular setup right here is this RackForms folder, this is what RackForms was originally called, and so therefore this is now the new version of RackForms running on our server. This guy is the old version of RackForms. I actually like to keep this on there for a couple of days because if something creeps up, we have a problem with this new version, all we have to do in order to reset everything back to what it was before is to simply rename our two folders. So I would just rename RackForms to RackForms-new and RackForms-old to RackForms. And now we're running that previous version of RackForms. It's a nice escape hatch, again, if anything were to happen with the new version. Now after a week, 2 weeks, a month, as soon as you're comfortable that you don't need this old folder anymore, then we can just basically issue a delete and get rid of that so that the newest version is just RackForms right here. So once again, to talk about the steps, the first thing we did is we made backups of everything, so our database and our files. Then I took the newest version and I unzipped it. Remember this guy right here? I then merged the files from that saved version from our server with the new version that we downloaded. And again, as you recall, those files were specifically in our RackForms app config file and then app move files config. I then took the output folder, again from that download, and I deleted it, and I took the version from the zip file from our server and put it right here. Then I deleted the install.php file from the new version. I then zipped up that instance and I uploaded it to my server, and then I unzipped it after doing a little bit of file renaming. Finally, I deleted all the old files and folders. And again, in this particular case, I'm going to keep this guy around just in case something creeps up, and maybe in a month or so I'll delete it. And that's basically it. So obviously there's a couple different steps here, but the idea is this particular method right here is usually the best way to keep downtime to a minimum, right? All we're doing at the end of the day is just swapping a folder name around, and that's how we're pointing to the newest version of RackForms. There are other ways of updating. I should just say, for the sake of completeness, one popular way is folks will just delete their entire RackForms folder. This is really popular for development environments, and they'll just run the installer again. You could do that. The only downside to that is you might lose any of your old jobs. Usually that's why it's only used for development environments. For production environments, a very popular way to do it is that we upload the newest version of RackForms, run the installer, and then we manually move the output folder from the old instance to the new. I should actually just point out briefly that this output folder right here, if we actually look at it, this is where all of our forms are stored. So anytime we create a form in RackForms, it gets a folder in our output forms folder. That's why we created a backup of that and moved it to our new instance before we uploaded this to the server, right? Because now when somebody runs the new version of RackForms, all of our jobs are still there. If you're doing development work, we usually don't care about any of these guys. We can blow these guys away. It's just for testing. All of our jobs are still available in the database. But for production instances, you obviously don't want to delete any of our job folders because then somebody trying to visit your forms won't be able to fill them out. But that's why then we could just move our forms, our output folder, over manually after we run the installer. Generally speaking though, even though this is a few more steps, I prefer this method because again, it's very, very safe. We have a nice backup of our system, and the downtime is very, very minimal as we're performing the update step, because all we're doing when we're performing the actual update process is just swapping a folder name around. So that's basically it. As we always like to say though, any questions about this, please let us know at info@rackforms.com, and thanks for watching.